What if I told you that everything you've been taught about self-improvement is backwards? That the very strategies most of us use to motivate ourselves, the harsh self-criticism, the constant comparisons, the refusal to accept anything less than perfection, are actually the primary obstacles standing between you and the life you want? That decades of rigorous psychological research have revealed a stunning paradox. The moment we stop fighting ourselves is precisely when genuine transformation becomes possible. Tonight, we're going to explore a scientific revolution that challenges one of the most deeply held beliefs in modern culture. The belief that we need to be hard on ourselves to succeed. That self-criticism is what keeps us in line. That accepting our flaws means giving up on growth. But here's what the research actually shows. And I promise you, this might be the most counterintuitive finding in all of psychology. The people who treat themselves with compassion, who respond to their failures with kindness rather than judgment, who acknowledge their pain rather than suppress it, who recognize their struggles as part of being human rather than evidence of personal deficiency, these people don't become complacent or self-indulgent. They become more resilient, more motivated, more capable of genuine change. How is this possible? How can accepting ourselves as we are lead to transformation? How can being kind to ourselves make us stronger rather than weaker? The answer involves a fascinating interplay of neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, and clinical research that reveals something profound about human nature. Something that might completely change how you relate to yourself. This is the story of self-compassion and self-acceptance. It's backed by decades of rigorous psychological research, yet it asks us to do something that feels almost revolutionary in our achievement-obsessed culture, to stop fighting ourselves and start being on our own side. Research evidence consistently demonstrates that when we finally stop demanding perfection from ourselves, when we accept our flawed humanity rather than wage war against it, something unexpected happens. We actually become more capable of growth, more resilient in the face of setbacks, more genuinely content with our lives. But before we can understand the healing power of self-compassion, we need to look at its shadow side. We need to examine what happens when our culture's obsession with feeling good creates what psychologists now call toxic positivity. The shadow of positivity. The term toxic positivity might seem like a contradiction. After all, isn't positivity supposed to be positive? Yet if you've ever shared a genuine struggle with someone only to be met with "just think positive" or "everything happens for a reason," you've encountered this phenomenon. You've felt the peculiar sting of having your pain dismissed in the name of staying upbeat. Toxics. Positivity began appearing with increasing frequency in psychological discourse around 20, though its roots trace back further. But it wasn't until the global pandemic, with its accompanying psychological stresses, that the concept truly entered mainstream awareness. Suddenly, people everywhere were grappling with genuine hardship, and the cultural mandate to maintain a positive outlook began to feel not just unhelpful, but actively harmful. So, what exactly is toxic positivity? According to researchers and clinicians who study this phenomenon, toxic positivity can be defined as the excessive and inappropriate emphasis on maintaining a positive mindset in all situations, to the point where it leads to the avoidance, suppression, or dismissal of authentic negative emotions. It's the insistence that negative emotions should be avoided at all costs. That feeling sad or anxious or angry means something is wrong with us. The distinction between healthy positivity and toxic positivity becomes clearer when we examine their approaches to difficult emotions. Healthy positivity acknowledges the full spectrum of human experience. It might sound like, this is really hard, and it's okay to feel upset about it. Let's think about what might help. Toxic positivity, in contrast, bypasses acknowledgement entirely. Don't be upset, just focus on the good things. At least it's not worse. Research into emotional suppression, including work by psychologists like Tabitha Kirkland at the University of Washington, helps us understand why toxic positivity is so problematic. Studies have demonstrated that consistently avoiding or suppressing negative emotions doesn't make them disappear. Instead, it creates what psychologists call a rebound effect. The suppressed emotions often return with greater intensity. Think of it like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. The harder you push it down, the more forcefully it erupts back to the surface when your grip finally falters. The consequences are far-reaching. When we engage in toxic positivity, we may experience increased stress and anxiety. We develop shame around our natural emotional responses. We become isolated, believing we're the only ones who struggle. And perhaps most insidiously, we lose access to the important information that emotions provide. Sadness tells us something matters. Anger signals a boundary has been crossed. Fear alerts us to potential danger. Author Susan Cain, in her 2022 book, Bittersweet, describes toxic positivity as a cultural directive that says, whatever you do, don't tell the truth of what it's like to be alive. This framing highlights how toxic positivity doesn't just affect individuals. It shapes our entire cultural conversation around well-being. When we collectively agree that negative emotions are unacceptable, we create a world where people suffer in silence, afraid to admit they're struggling for fear of being seen as weak or ungrateful. What makes toxic positivity particularly insidious is that it often comes from genuine caring. The friend who tells you it could be worse isn't trying to hurt you. They're uncomfortable with your pain and don't know how to help. But the impact remains the same. Your experience is invalidated. Your emotions are dismissed, and you're left feeling more alone than before. There's another way, a way that honors the full truth of human experience while still supporting growth and healing. And that way begins with understanding self-compassion. The foundations of self-compassion. If toxic positivity asks us to deny parts of our experience, self-compassion invites us to embrace it all. The woman who brought self-compassion to the forefront of Western psychology is Dr. Kristin Neff, an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. In 2003, Neff published her groundbreaking paper in which she became the first researcher to formally operationalize and measure self-compassion as a psychological construct. This work would go on to spark thousands of studies and fundamentally change how psychologists think about self-relating. Neff's definition of self-compassion rests on three interrelated components, each essential to the whole. The first is self-kindness versus self-judgment. Self-kindness involves being warm and understanding toward ourselves when we suffer, fail, or feel inadequate, rather than ignoring our pain or attacking ourselves with harsh self-criticism. Think about how you speak to a good friend who has just experienced a setback. Would you berate them? Tell them they're worthless? Probably not. More likely, you'd offer words of comfort and perspective. Self-kindness asks us to offer ourselves the same quality of caring response. The second component is common humanity versus isolation. This element recognizes that suffering, failure, and imperfection are part of the shared human experience, not personal deficiencies that separate us from others. When we're going through a difficult time, there's often a sense that we're the only ones struggling, that everyone else has it together. Self-compassion helps us remember that all humans are imperfect, that everyone makes mistakes, that struggling is not a sign of personal inadequacy, but rather evidence of our common humanity. The third component is mindfulness versus over-identification. Mindfulness, in the context of self-compassion, involves holding our painful thoughts and feelings in balanced awareness, rather than suppressing them or exaggerating them. It means being present with our suffering without being overwhelmed by it. If we're feeling sad, mindfulness allows us to acknowledge, I'm feeling sad right now, rather than either denying the sadness or becoming convinced that sadness defines our entire existence. What's particularly important about Neff's formulation is that these three components work together as a system. Self-kindness, without common humanity, might lead to a kind of self-pity. Poor me, I'm having such a hard time. But when we add common humanity, it becomes, I'm having a hard time, and this is part of being human. Neff was drawing on centuries of Buddhist philosophical thought in developing this framework, but she was doing something novel, translating these ancient practices into a language that Western psychology could measure and study. To measure self-compassion, Neff developed the self-compassion scale in 2003, which has since been translated into numerous languages and used in thousands of research studies worldwide. Early research using this scale revealed fascinating patterns. Neff and her colleagues found that self-compassion was strongly associated with psychological well-being. People who scored higher in self-compassion reported greater life satisfaction, more happiness, more optimism, and more curiosity and connectedness. They experienced less anxiety, depression, rumination, and fear of failure. One of the most important early findings was that self-compassion was not associated with self-indulgence or lack of motivation, despite many people's fears. In fact, research showed the opposite. Self-compassionate people were more likely to take personal initiative to make needed changes in their lives. They were motivated by a desire for health and well-being, rather than by fear of failure or harsh self-criticism. But perhaps most importantly, Neff's work demonstrated that self-compassion could be taught and cultivated. Unlike traits that might be relatively fixed, self-compassion appeared to be a skill that could be developed through practice. Rogers paradox. Acceptance enables change. In the 1950s, a clinical psychologist named Carl Rogers was developing ideas that would seem radical for their time. Rogers' most revolutionary idea was deceptively simple. People have within themselves vast resources for self-understanding and for altering their self-concepts and behavior. This was a fundamentally optimistic view of human nature. At the core of Rogers' theory was the concept of unconditional positive regard, accepting and respecting others as they are, without conditions or reservations. But Rogers believed this wasn't just something therapists should offer clients. It was something we needed to develop toward ourselves. Rogers argued that many psychological problems arose from what he called conditions of worth, the internalized belief that we are only valuable when we meet certain standards. These conditions of worth typically develop in childhood. A child learns that they receive love and approval when they get good grades, when they excel at sports, when they meet their parents' expectations. The child internalizes the message that they are lovable only conditionally. This creates a split between the real self and the ideal self. The real self is who we actually are. The ideal self is who we think we should be. When there's a significant gap between these two selves, Rogers called this incongruence, and he identified it as a primary source of psychological distress. This is where Rogers articulated what has become one of psychology's most profound paradoxes. In his 1961 book, On Becoming a Person, Rogers wrote, "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change." This statement might seem counterintuitive. Doesn't change require recognizing that we're not good enough as we are? Rogers' insight was precisely the opposite. He observed that genuine change becomes possible only when we stop waging war against ourselves. When we're locked in a struggle against who we are, our energy goes into defense and avoidance. But when we can accept ourselves as we are, flawed, imperfect, human, something shifts. We can look at ourselves honestly, which means we can see clearly where change might genuinely serve us. we can approach that change from a place of self-respect rather than self-loathing. Rogers' work anticipated Neff's emphasis on self-kindness. His concept of common humanity, the understanding that all humans struggle with the gap between their real and ideal selves, prefigures Neff's component of recognizing our shared humanity. Rogers' paradox that self-acceptance enables change provides crucial insight into why self-compassion is so powerful. Self-compassion versus self-esteem, a crucial distinction. For decades, self-esteem was held up as the gold standard of psychological health. But as research accumulated, a more complicated picture emerged. And this is where Kristin Neff's work on self-compassion became particularly illuminating, because she began to demonstrate that self-compassion and self-esteem, while related, are fundamentally different ways of relating to oneself. Self-esteem is typically defined as an overall evaluation of one's worth or value. It's essentially a judgment we make about ourselves. Am I good or bad? Worthy or unworthy? High self-esteem means we judge ourselves favorably. Low self-esteem means we judge ourselves unfavorably. And crucially, self-esteem is inherently evaluative and comparative. To have high self-esteem, we generally need to feel that we're above average in some way. Research has documented the better than average effect, the widespread tendency for people to rate themselves as more intelligent, more ethical, and more skilled than the average person. One study found that 90% of drivers believed they were more skilled than average, a statistical impossibility. This creates several problems. First, self-esteem is inherently contingent. It depends on outcomes, on comparisons, on meeting standards. When we succeed, our self-esteem goes up. When we fail, it plummets. It's like a ping pong ball, bouncing up and down based on external circumstances. Second, the focus on evaluation and comparison can lead to ego defensiveness. When our self-esteem is threatened, we often react defensively. We might dismiss criticism, blame others, or make excuses. Third, the pursuit of self-esteem can paradoxically lead to narcissism. Research has shown a positive correlation between self-esteem and narcissistic traits. Enter self-compassion as a fundamentally different approach. In a groundbreaking 2009 study, Neff and her colleague Roos Vonk directly compared self-compassion and self-esteem in 2,187 participants. They found that self-compassion and self-esteem were moderately correlated, about 0.65, but they differed in several crucial ways. Self-compassion predicted more stable feelings of self-worth over time. Self-compassionate people showed less fluctuation because self-compassion doesn't depend on success or favorable comparisons. Self-compassion also had a stronger negative association with social comparison than self-esteem did. Self-compassionate people were less likely to constantly compare themselves to others, to need to feel superior. Perhaps most tellingly, self-esteem was significantly associated with narcissism, while self-compassion was not. This finding was crucial. It suggested that self-compassion offers a way to feel positively about ourselves without the ego inflation and self-centeredness that can come with high self-esteem. The most helpful way to think about the difference is this. Self-esteem is about judging ourselves positively, while self-compassion is about relating to ourselves kindly. Self-esteem asks, am I good enough? Self-compassion asks, how can I support myself right now? Self-esteem looks outward for validation and comparison. Self-compassion looks inward with understanding and care. This distinction becomes especially important in moments of failure or difficulty. When we face a setback, self-esteem often takes a hit. Self-compassion, by contrast, steps in exactly when we're struggling. It says, this is hard, I'm hurting, and it's okay to hurt. This is part of being human. Research on motivation helps illuminate why this matters. For a long time, People feared that self-compassion would undermine motivation. The data shows exactly the opposite. Self-compassionate people are actually more motivated to change and grow, but for different reasons. They pursue achievement not to prove their worth, but because the activity itself is meaningful. When they encounter setbacks, they view them as opportunities to learn rather than as threats to their self-worth. What happens in the brain? Understanding self-compassion isn't just a philosophical exercise. It's increasingly becoming a neurobiological one. Researchers have begun using brain imaging technology to observe what happens when we practice self-compassion versus self-criticism. And what they've discovered helps explain why self-compassion has such powerful effects. When people engage in harsh self-judgment, brain regions associated with threat perception become activated. Specifically, researchers consistently observe activation in the anterior insula and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, regions that form what neuroscientists call the salience network. This is essentially the brain's alarm system, involved in detecting threats and processing pain. Research published in the journal Neuroimage in 2009 used fMRI to compare brain activation during self-criticism versus self-reassurance. When participants engaged in self-criticism, researchers observed activation in regions associated with error processing and behavioral inhibition. It was as if the brain was treating the self as an error that needed to be corrected. When the same participants engaged in self-reassurance, a component of self-compassion, a completely different pattern emerged. They showed activation in the left temporal pole and insula, regions associated with empathy, caregiving, and positive emotional processing. It was as if a different brain system had come online, one focused on care rather than threat. Particularly fascinating is the involvement of the periaqueductal gray, PAG, a region deep in the midbrain. Research published in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience found that compassion, both for others and for oneself, activated the PAG. This region is involved in parental caregiving behaviors across mammalian species. When we extend compassion to ourselves, research suggests we're activating this same caregiving system. A 2020 meta-analysis examining fMRI studies of compassion identified 7 key brain regions consistently activated across studies, with the largest peaks in the PAG, anterior insula, and anterior cingulate cortex. But here's what's interesting. While these regions are involved in both threat processing and compassion, the pattern of activation is different. In compassionate states, these regions show more modulated, regulated activation. The research evidence suggests that compassion doesn't eliminate our awareness of suffering. Rather, it changes how we relate to that awareness. Instead of alarm bells blaring continuously, we have a more measured response. We notice the pain, but we're not overwhelmed by it. Research has also examined heart rate variability, HRV, during compassion practice. HRV is considered an indicator of parasympathetic nervous system activity, the rest and digest system that helps us calm down. Studies have shown that compassion meditation increases HRV, suggesting that compassion literally helps our nervous system shift out of threat mode. All of this neurobiological research points to a consistent theme. Self-compassion involves a fundamentally different neural response than self-criticism. While self-criticism activates threat systems, compassion activates caregiving and soothing systems. And here's what might be most important. These aren't fixed patterns. The brain shows remarkable plasticity. When people practice self-compassion, they're not just changing their thoughts, they're actually changing their brain, strengthening neural pathways associated with emotional regulation. The neuroscience also helps explain why self-compassion feels so different from toxic positivity. Toxic positivity asks us to suppress or deny negative emotions. From a neuroscience perspective, research suggests this is like trying to override our threat system through sheer willpower. and studies indicate it often backfires. Self-compassion takes a different approach, based on what brain imaging studies reveal. It doesn't ask us to deny our pain. Instead, it acknowledges the pain, activating our salience network, while simultaneously bringing online our caregiving system through kind, supportive self-talk. We're holding both awareness of difficulty and a caring response to that difficulty. The neuroscience evidence suggests this dual activation of awareness and care may be what allows for genuine emotion regulation rather than mere suppression. Evidence-based interventions. Programs that work. The most extensively studied intervention is the HASAU Mindful Self-Compassion Program, MSC, developed by Christopher Germer and Kristin Neff. The program consists of 8 weekly meetings, each lasting 2.5 hours, plus a half-day silent retreat. Each session focuses on a specific theme: discovering self-compassion, practicing mindfulness, understanding the difference between self-compassion and self-esteem, developing a compassionate inner voice, living in accordance with the values, managing difficult emotions, working with challenging relationships, and embracing your life. In their 2013 randomized controlled trial, published in the Journal of Clinical Psychology, Neff and Germer compared 27 people who completed MSC to 24 people in a waitlist control group. The results were striking. Compared to the control group, people who completed MSC showed significant increases in self-compassion, mindfulness, compassion for others, life satisfaction, and happiness. They showed significant decreases in depression, anxiety, stress, and emotional avoidance. The follow-up data became especially compelling. Neff and Germer assessed participants again at 6 months and 1 year after the program ended. Not only did the gains persist, for most measures, they were maintained or even increased over time. Self-compassion levels remained significantly elevated a full year after the program. Life satisfaction actually increased from the end of the program to the 1-year follow-up. Subsequent research has demonstrated that MSC works for diverse populations: healthcare professionals struggling with burnout, diabetes patients dealing with disease-related distress, adolescents navigating identity challenges, people with chronic pain, and trauma survivors. A randomized controlled trial with diabetes patients, published in Diabetes Care in 2016, found that a brief, mindful self-compassion intervention significantly improved depression, diabetes distress, and even HbA1c levels, a measure of blood sugar control. Meta-analyses have attempted to synthesize findings across all self-compassion intervention studies. A 2019 meta-analysis found that all 6 components of self-compassion, self-kindness, self-judgment, common humanity, isolation, mindfulness, and over-identification changed simultaneously as a result of training. This is important because it suggests the 3 main components really do work together as a system. Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, ACT-T, developed by Stephen Hayes, shares deep connections with self-compassion work. ACT-T rests on a radical premise that psychological suffering is not primarily caused by the presence of negative thoughts and feelings, but by our attempts to avoid or eliminate them. The core problem, Hayes proposed, is psychological inflexibility. ACT organizes its approach around 6 core processes that work together to promote psychological flexibility. Acceptance, allowing internal experiences to come and go without struggling. Cognitive diffusion, seeing thoughts as thoughts rather than truths. Being present, mindfulness. Self as context, recognizing we are more than our thoughts and feelings. Values, discovering what matters. And committed action, doing what aligns with values even when difficult. The empirical support for ACT-T is extensive. As of January 2025, there were over 1,300 randomized controlled trials of ACT. Meta-analyses have shown that ACT is effective across a remarkable range of problems, including anxiety, depression, chronic pain, substance use, and eating disorders. What's exciting about all this intervention research is that self-compassion training doesn't require lengthy commitments. While the standard MSc program is 8 weeks, research has shown that even brief interventions can be effective. Studies using 2 weeks self-compassion training have shown significant improvements. Even brief laboratory-based self-compassion inductions show immediate effects. Practical strategies. Cultivating self-compassion. Daily. Understanding self-compassion is one thing. Actually practicing it is another. The good news is that self-compassion can be developed through practice. Here are evidence-based strategies. The self-compassion break. This brief exercise can be done anytime you notice you're having a difficult moment. It works by engaging all 3 components of self-compassion. When you notice you're suffering, begin by acknowledging the difficulty with mindfulness. This is a moment of suffering, or this hurts. Then acknowledge common humanity. Suffering is part of life, or others have felt this too. Finally, offer yourself kindness. May I be kind to myself, or may I give myself the compassion I need. This can be done in just 30 seconds. Compassionate letter writing. When dealing with significant struggle or harsh self-judgment, write yourself a letter from the perspective of an unconditionally loving, compassionate friend. Imagine someone who knows all your flaws, but loves you anyway. What would this compassionate friend say about your situation? They would acknowledge how hard it is, recognize the suffering, offer perspective, and express unconditional care. After writing, read it slowly, taking in the words as if they're genuinely coming from someone who cares deeply about you, because they are, from the wisest, kindest part of yourself. Self-compassionate self-talk. Notice when you catch yourself thinking harshly and consciously respond differently. Ask, what would I say to a good friend in this situation? Then say that to yourself. This isn't about positive thinking or denying real problems. It's about shifting from harsh judgment to supportive understanding. You might think, I made a mistake, and that's hard. Everyone messes up sometimes. What would be helpful right now? Working with difficult emotions. When a difficult emotion arises, instead of pushing it away, try compassionate embodiment. Gently focus attention on where you feel the emotion in your body. Rather than fighting these sensations, bring a quality of gentle, caring attention to them. You might place your hand over the area where you feel the emotion, offering a gesture of comfort. You might silently say, "It's okay. I'm here with you." Often, when we can hold our emotions with kindness rather than fighting them, they naturally shift rather than intensifying. Common obstacles arise in practice. Some worry self-compassion is selfish. The research decisively contradicts this. Others fear it will undermine motivation. Again, research shows the opposite. Some find that practices bring up painful emotions that had been buried beneath self-criticism. This is actually a sign the practices are working, but it means pacing yourself appropriately. The key insight: self-compassion is both simple and profound. Simple because it ultimately comes down to treating yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a friend. Profound because this simple shift can transform your entire relationship with yourself and with life. The science of change. How it actually works. How does self-compassion actually create change? Mediational studies have provided crucial insights into the pathways through which self-compassion produces its effects. Reduction of shame. Shame is characterized by a global negative evaluation of the self. I am bad, rather than I did something bad. Research has consistently found strong negative correlations between self-compassion and shame. When people develop self-compassion, their shame levels decrease, and this reduction partially explains improvements in mental health. Why? The common humanity component directly counters shame's isolating message. Shame says, "I'm uniquely flawed." Common humanity reminds us everyone struggles. Imperfection is universal. Reduced experiential avoidance. Experiential avoidance, the tendency to avoid unwanted thoughts, feelings, and sensations, is involved in many psychological problems. Self-compassion allows us to reduce experiential avoidance because it makes our internal experiences less threatening. When we know we'll treat ourselves kindly, even in the presence of difficult emotions, those emotions become more tolerable. This increased willingness to experience difficult emotions, paradoxically, often leads to reduced distress. Enhanced emotion regulation. Research shows that self-compassion strengthens our ability to regulate emotions effectively, not suppressing them, but modulating their intensity and responding skillfully. Self-compassionate people show more adaptive emotion regulation strategies. The neuroscience evidence suggests we're activating regulatory regions of the prefrontal cortex while soothing the amygdala's threat response, potentially creating neural conditions conducive to balanced emotional responding. Growth mindset and learning. Orientation. Self-compassion naturally supports a growth mindset because it removes the threat from failure. When you know you'll treat yourself kindly even if you fail, failure becomes informative rather than devastating. Research has documented associations between self-compassion and growth mindset. Self-compassion also enhances self-efficacy. A meta-analysis of 60 studies found a medium positive correlation between self-compassion and self-efficacy. Improved relationship quality. A 2021 meta-analysis found that people higher in self-compassion tend to have more secure attachment, healthier relationships, and more constructive approaches to conflict. The research findings suggest an explanation. Self-compassion appears to help us acknowledge mistakes without becoming flooded with shame, which may enable us to take responsibility without becoming defensive. Healthier motivation. Research shows that self-compassionate people are more motivated, but for healthier reasons. They pursue mastery goals, learning and growth, rather than performance goals, proving their worth. They show greater persistence when facing obstacles. A key study had participants recall a personal failure and then either engage in self-compassionate writing or complete a control task. Participants in the self-compassion condition subsequently showed greater motivation to improve compared to controls. Long-term effects deserve attention. Studies following people over several years have found that self-compassion in early adulthood predicts better mental health outcomes years later. Once cultivated, it tends to self-reinforce. When you're kind to yourself, you feel better, which makes it easier to be kind to yourself, creating a virtuous cycle. Hanchad. Wholeness over perfection. The reveal. We've explored toxic positivity, the harm of suppressing authentic emotions. We trace self-compassion's emergence through Neff's 3 components: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. We discovered Roger's profound paradox that accepting ourselves as we are enables genuine change. We compared self-compassion to self-esteem, finding more stable well-being without the downsides. The neuroscience revealed that self-compassion and self-criticism activate fundamentally different brain systems, care versus threat, and that compassion practice literally reshapes our neural circuitry. We examined evidence-based interventions like mindful self-compassion and acceptance and commitment therapy. We explored practical strategies for daily life and examined the mechanisms of change. But now, let me share something that might reframe everything you've heard tonight. What if self-compassion isn't actually about being nicer to yourself? What if, at its deepest level, it's about recognizing a fundamental truth that our culture has trained us to forget? Here's the reveal. For most of your life, you've probably been operating under a profound misunderstanding. You've been taught that you need to improve yourself, fix yourself, transform yourself into someone better. The entire self-help industry, the wellness culture, even much of psychology, they've all reinforced this narrative. There's the current you, flawed and inadequate, and there's the future you, the version you're working toward becoming. But here's what the self-compassion research ultimately demonstrates. You were never broken in the first place. All that harsh self-criticism, all that comparison and judgment, all that striving to be someone other than who you are, it was never necessary. It was never helpful. It was, from the beginning, a solution to a problem that didn't exist. The problem wasn't that you weren't good enough. The problem was that you believed you weren't good enough. And then you tried to solve that problem by attacking yourself, by demanding perfection, by rejecting your humanity, which of course only reinforced the original belief. This is what makes self-compassion so revolutionary and so threatening to the cultural narratives we've internalized. Self-compassion doesn't offer you a better way to fix yourself. It offers you a way to stop believing you need fixing. When Carl Rogers said, "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change," he wasn't describing a technique for more effective self-improvement. He was describing what happens when you stop waging war against yourself, when you lay down your weapons, when you recognize that the enemy you've been fighting, yourself, was never actually your enemy. The research on motivation helps us understand this. Studies consistently show that self-compassionate people are more motivated and more successful at making positive changes. But here's the crucial insight. They're not motivated by inadequacy. They're not driven by the belief that their current self is unacceptable. They're motivated by care, by genuinely wanting well-being for themselves, the same way they'd want it for someone they love. This is radically different from the motivation our culture typically promotes. We're taught to hate ourselves into shape, to shame ourselves into success, to use disgust with who we are as fuel for transformation. And it works, sometimes, in the short term. But the research shows it's unsustainable, that it depletes rather than nourishes us, that it leads to exactly the kinds of problems, anxiety, depression, burnout, disconnection, that we see epidemic in modern life. Self-compassion offers something else entirely. It offers the possibility of change rooted not in rejection, but in care, not in judgment, but in understanding, not in violence toward the self, but in tenderness. And here's what might be the most surprising finding of all. This approach doesn't just work better for your psychological health. It actually works better for achieving your goals. The research demonstrates that self-compassionate people are more likely to stick with difficult tasks, to persist after failure, to take on challenging goals. Not because they're harder on themselves, but because they're kinder. So, what does all this mean for you? It means you can stop. You can stop the constant self-improvement project, the relentless pursuit of a better version of yourself, the exhausting work of trying to be someone you're not. Not because you should give up on growth. The research clearly shows self-compassionate people grow more, not less. But because genuine growth doesn't require self-rejection as its foundation. It means you can treat the struggles you're facing right now not as evidence that you're failing at life, but as evidence that you're living it. Everyone struggles. Everyone fails. Everyone feels inadequate sometimes. This is the human condition. When you can hold your struggles with the same compassion you'd offer anyone else, you're not being weak or self-indulgent. You're being wise. It means you can bring curiosity, rather than judgment to your patterns. When you notice self-criticism, you don't need to criticize yourself for being self-critical. You can simply notice, there's that harsh voice again. What am I actually feeling underneath? This quality of interested, caring attention is what allows genuine insight and change. The goal was never perfection. That was always an illusion, a moving target that recedes as we approach. The goal is wholeness, embracing all of who you are, the strengths and the struggles, the successes and the failures. Wholeness includes everything. It excludes nothing. And when you can hold yourself with that kind of complete acceptance, something remarkable happens. You stop fighting yourself. You start living fully. Here's the truth that the research consistently supports. You have permission to be human. You have permission to struggle. You have permission to not have it all figured out. You have permission to make mistakes, to feel difficult emotions, to be imperfect. You've always had this permission. You just forgot. Or rather, you were taught to forget. Self-compassion is simply the practice of remembering. If there's one thing I hope you take from our time together tonight, it's this. You deserve your own compassion. Not someday, when you've finally gotten it all together. Not once you've achieved enough, or fixed enough, or become enough. Right now. Exactly as you are. In this moment, with all your flaws and fears and imperfections, you are worthy of kindness. And here's the beautiful paradox one more time. When you finally accept yourself as you are, when you stop demanding that you be different, when you treat yourself with the compassion you've always deserved, that's precisely when genuine transformation becomes possible. Not because you're trying to change, but because you're no longer spending your energy fighting yourself. Not because you're inadequate, but because you're finally free to grow from a place of wholeness, rather than lack. Before you drift off to sleep, before you return to your day, take just a moment. Place your hand over your heart if you'd like. Feel the warmth there. And remember, this heart that beats in your chest, this consciousness that experiences your life, this being that you are, was never broken, never needed fixing, never required harsh judgment to be worthy of care. You were always whole. You just needed permission to remember. May you treat yourself gently. May you remember your shared humanity. May you hold your experiences with balanced awareness. And may you discover, in practicing self-compassion, that the transformation you were seeking was never about becoming someone different. It was always about coming home to who you already are. If you found something valuable in our exploration tonight, if this resonated with you in some way, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps others find these explorations, too. Until next time, be kind to yourself, not because you need improvement, but because you deserve kindness, simply by virtue of being alive. Sleep well.